We are obviously here at the Museum of Anthropology, and one of the wonderful things about putting this together, there were only wonderful things about putting this event together. One of the wonderful things has been the opportunity to collaborate with people here at UBC and to realize the wonderful resources that exist here and that can be used in a lot of different ways, both for teaching and research purposes. And it's a special thrill to be at the Museum of Anthropology and to have, from the outset, received such a gracious and warm encouragement to see this space as an extension of our research and teaching agendas. And for that reason, it's a pleasure to invite Anthony Shelton to welcome us to his institution, and I just can't say how much I appreciate having had the opportunity to be here today and to have worked with you thus far. So.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Neil and also Jill Baird from the museum side for making this conference possible and for giving us the opportunity to host part of it. It's really important to me because the kind of issues that the conference is addressing are precisely those issues that I want the museum, as a teaching and as a research museum, as well as a public museum, to engage more widely with. I'm going to give you a kind of a quick introduction to MOA and where we're going, but I'm going to do it in relationship to a particular idea of what museums might be and what they can achieve. This museum, I guess, it has an international reputation which was kind of enhanced by Jim Clifford's 1991 article on 4 Northwest Coast museums. And I think the importance of that article is that it represents a turning point in museology, where instead of people interested in museums are looking at museums, specific museums, Clifford looks at a whole semantic field, and within that field he situates 2 First Nation cultural centres and 2 museums, one of which is MOA. For me, having kind of taught museology for a lot of my life, I was getting incredibly bored with teaching it and reading it, and even more bored by writing about it. And once I reread this article a number of times, it suddenly kind of dawned on me that museums, you've got to look at museums in much wider contexts. You've got to look at them in relationship to other museums, in relationship to other exhibiting institutions within a specific area, and also in relationship to monuments, and most importantly, in relationships to national, regional, and local concepts of patrimony and what those concepts are about. We're kind of I think this approach is still very relevant to museums, and in fact there's a lot of work to be done. But museums, in a different way, are also increasingly incorporated into local, national and international contexts. This museum, MOA, has undergone a major expansion and renewal, which has been based or focused on its research infrastructure. And it's this research infrastructure that opens a kind of a portal to developing new relationships and allowing greater connectivity and integration. I believe, and I'm going to very quickly run through some of the characteristics of this, some of the traits of this infrastructure, that by using it, we can move museums away, or certainly move this museum away, to being defined primarily, perhaps not by its collections, but as a hub within a whole series of different networks. And so it's this kind of emphasis on networks, and that makes it particularly appropriate that you've invited us to work with you. Networks in a number of different ways. First of all, we have virtual networks, and over the past 5 years, the museum has put all its collections, all 36,000 collections, have been digitized. And you can look at them. I think there are 14 monitors across the museum, so you can look at you can get an overview of what we have. We've been developing something called the RRN, the Reciprocal Research Network. And this is an interactive platform that's been co-developed with ourselves, but also with 3 First Nation communities, with Stolo Nation, Musqueam, and also with the Umista Cultural Society in Alert Bay. We've also had 12 museums who have been working with us as partners, and these are museums across Canada, a number of US museums, and also the museums of the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And what this system allows us to do is basically provide an interface to all the collections held by all those museums which relate to the Northwest Coast. So it allows us to do searches across museums. It also allows us to create virtual research groups, which can be international, bringing together communities with collections and with researchers. So this is a very, very important in terms of what we're doing. The third kind of virtual network is the social networks, such as Twitter and Facebook, which we've also kind of signed up to. And all these kind of virtual networks, I think, have a tremendous potential to redefine what we do, what we are, and the questions that are being asked. And I'll come back to that in a little while. There's a number of other kind of hubs that we're creating. There's kind of multiple hubs around what we've called the multiversity galleries. And the idea of the multiversity gallery was really that an idea that's been put together by an African scholar, Paul Wangula, and Claudio Alvarez in India, that through colonialism, in local and regional the plethora of epistemologies has been abandoned in relationship to accepting Western epistemologies and the knowledge systems that come from that. So the characteristic of this exhibition space is that we've worked over 5 years, and with relations that predate those 5 years, working with First Nations to ask them how they want to be exhibited, rather than using museum criteria. We've also done that work in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, and to some extent in Ghana as well. And we're hoping that that this will be continuing work that will characterize what we're doing there. We also have the second museum to have a First Nation research center. And again, this is to welcome First Nations. It comprises of a language laboratory, oral history lab, a lounge where people can come and relax, particularly elders, and research rooms. So again, this opens a possibility of a kind of a new or a kind of an enhanced material physical hub. And then we're also a teaching and research hub. We teach. We have. We house the archaeology. Archaeology unit of the anthropology department here. We have, I think, 5 laboratories and very, very good equipment. And we're kind of creating. Well, there was a hub, but we're enlarging that hub now. We have state-of-the-art conservation laboratories, which is, again, we use in teaching as well as doing conservation here. Jill has been working to develop an MA in museum education, which I think we're launching this year, next semester, yeah. And we've also been working with the anthropology department on examining, and so now you can basically concentrate in museology from year 2 right through to year 4, and there are other programs around that too. We're also looking at kind of twinning our museums with other museums around the world, and the 2 so far that we've been talking to are the Kunming Minorities Museum in China, and the Veracruz Museum of Anthropology. And then we have transient networks, and these are around exhibitions. We have a large exhibition space, so for the first time we can bring and we can curate exhibitions that are much greater, which are much larger than we've been able to do before. So over the next 3 years, we have, I think we have 3 First Nation exhibits, Border Zones, which is on at present. We're doing Man Ray, African art, and the modernist lens. Jill, again, is working on a Middle Eastern, contemporary Middle East art exhibition. And we're doing an exhibition on women that have gone missing from the East Side. So, in a way, I think what this is intended to do is to break down the barriers which separate classical art, contemporary art, and ethnographic pieces. Because, in a way, this institutionalization is a racist institutionalization that we all know who gets exhibited in these different museums. So we want to kind of mix that together because the production of culture is occurring in multiple sites at the same time. So these temporary exhibitions, what we hope will do is they'll generate conferences, symposia. They'll be also used in teaching, in undergraduate teaching. I think probably the most exciting thing is what these different hubs and networks will create is they'll demand us to rethink what a museum is. And I think if you just look at the relationship between the virtual and the material, the everyday, there's all kinds of questions that asks for. Whereas museums naively thought they could collect intangible cultural property by digitizing it, we now know what's being created is a different type, epistemologically speaking, of knowledge. And I think that the creation of a third term knowledge, together with the complexities that being part of a virtual network brings to the museum and the potential for dialogue, is something that will basically make us rewrite what museums do in the material world, in the everyday material world. So I want to welcome you here. The new museum only opened, I think, 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago. And it's a real honor for me to be able to host on behalf of the museum this conference. And thank you very much for being here and for participating. And thank you, Jill and Neil, for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
I should also mention that the Reciprocal Research Network, which Anthony alluded to, is the featured resource on the Global Encounters site currently, and until we find a better featured resource to include there, it will remain the featured resource. I also was planning to thank her later with everyone else, but I should also say at the outset that this would not have been at all possible had not Jill Baird been extremely welcoming of this idea and a joy to work with and all of that. So there's a special homage to her as well. Finally, I just wanted to say very quickly what is going to happen today, because it's slightly different and a little looser than the past couple of days. We're going to have this session, and then you all will have time to wander in the museum, to visit the Border Zones exhibit with the curators of that exhibit. We will have a time set during that period to discuss the exhibit for those who are interested. For those who would like to sort of wander around, that's open as well. And then we'll have the last 2 sessions later today, and finally the keynote by Taiyake Alfred. So if this works, I'd now like to invite my colleague in history, Alejandra Bronfman, who will be the commentator and commentator for the first session.
Thank you, Neil. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in this gorgeous theater and this gorgeous new space, which I'm very excited about visiting later. Welcome, everybody, to this panel on Caribbean diasporas. We have 3 speakers, and the first speaker is James Delbourgo, is Associate Professor of History of Science and Atlantic World at Rutgers University. His interests range from physical science and experiment to natural history and travel, and the intersections between them in the 17th and 18th centuries, including topics such as history of the body, experimental apparatus, collecting, ethnography, and race, the movement of objects, specimens, and techniques through global networks. He is the author of many articles and at least 3 books, from what I could tell from the list. A Most Amazing Scene of Wonders, Electricity and Enlightenment in Early America, Science and Empire in the Atlantic World, co-edited with another one of our speakers, Nicholas Dew, and The Brokered World, Go-Betweens and Global Intelligence, 1770 and 1820, with Simon Schaffer, Lisa Roberts, and Kapil Raj. And just thinking about that all makes me a little bit tired, but James Delbourgo will speak to us today about slave whips. Just click it, right?
Where's the pointer? It's the same thing. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandra. Thank you very much indeed, Neil, for this extraordinary effort and generosity of labor in bringing us all together. And today in particular, in this absolutely remarkable setting, it's a true honor to address you briefly about this object, which was actually called a manatee strap, and I'm going to speak informally, so I took that part of it kind of literally. And I'm actually going to talk about an object, a 3D object, not a map, not an image, and that's because I'm weird. The basic thing I'd like to talk to you about is the fact that this manatee strap from Jamaica, from the West Indies, appeared in a London coffee house at some point between roughly 1700 and 1720s. The first recorded instance of it being in this coffee house is 1729. This is a page from a kind of public catalogue from Don Soltero's Coffee Room of Curiosities. Catalogue, published 1729, London. You can see number 17, about 10 items down, 7 items down, a manatee strap. So here is a published list of items on display in this smoky Chelsea coffee house. My question is simply, how did it get there? Why did it get there? What was its itinerary? How do itineraries and places affect the perception of things and objects, which of course must never be placelessly considered, but objects are always somewhere, and where they are depends on what they has an influence on what they can mean. So I'm interested in how this manatee strap, i.e. a strap, a whip made from manatee, made from the hide of a Caribbean sea cow. This object was in the possession of Sir Hans Sloane, whose collection became the founding collection of the British Museum when it opened in 1759. This is a page or a transcription of a page from Sloane's Miscellanies catalogue, a catalogue of some 2,000 miscellaneous things. That's his term, late 17th, early 18th century. And you see, I wanted to kind of show you the catalogue, the registry, the inventory of things coming in, and we learn, and this is private, right? So you've seen a public image of a list of assembled displayed things. Here's a private catalogue, manuscript catalogue, the middle item, 1090, a manatee strap for whipping the Negro slaves in the hot West India plantations from Dr. Covell. So that's already quite interesting, because it tells us that Sloane did not collect this item himself, even though he went to Jamaica between 1687 and 1689 and brought back 800 plant specimens, most famously. I'll show you some images later. I want to kind of just give you the main points that I want to make first, and I'll leave this up here. But this already I like very much, because one of the things I want to suggest, probably quite unoriginally, it must be said, is that there's no such thing as collecting, and there's no such thing as a collector. And here I think I'm stealing from some recent remarks by the Portuguese literary scholar and philosopher Miguel Tamen, which is simply to say that the movement of objects, things, their itineraries, their modes of exchange and acquisition are so various, so specific, that in fact to think of Sloane as the collector seems very unhelpful here, seems to give all the agency in the accumulation and the movement of these thousands of things in his collection, seems to make it his matter, his business, his intentionality. And that's clearly not the case with this manatee strap. It is given to him. This is a gift. So it's very useful, I think, to ask what is collecting, and not to make any assumptions about itineraries of exchange. So Sloane, as you probably know, and I won't recite his extremely august and, let's say, stultifyingly august biography, becomes a president of the Royal Society, president of the Royal College of Physicians, goes to Jamaica in the 1680s, spends half a century amassing over 200,000 natural and artificial objects, books, manuscripts, and so on, dies in 1753, becomes the founding collection for the British Museum. I want to stress briefly the Jamaican voyage, which he undertook in 1687 to 1689, simply to foreground the process of exchange and the immersion that Sloane had in the world of plantation slavery in Jamaica, precisely at a time when Jamaica was in transition from white indentured servitude to forced African migration and labor, from Bites of Benin and Biafra in particular in this period to Jamaica. And I want to stress also, in addition to just kind of the narrative moment of a transition from Jamaica as a privateering base to an increasingly large-scale slavery-based sugar-producing plantation economy, the set of exchanges that took place between two displaced groups, one voluntarily, one involuntarily. So we're not talking about indigeneities here as such, but of course displaced Africans and self-displacing white planters. And Sloane, when he's collecting his botanical specimens, travels through the island of Jamaica from the south to the north and visits not only plantation to plantation, but also attends to some very interesting spaces of mixture, markets where enslaved Africans sell produce from provision plantations. He visits provision plantations, or slave gardens, as some would have called them, as well. So there are these sites of exchange that are very important to generating the famed herbarium that now sits in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, just recently redeposited in the great white egg of the Darwin Center 2 cocoon. So it's a story about transplantation rather than indigeneity. Now I want to come back to the strap, because I don't have very much time. So the strap is a gift. And I think that what I want to emphasize here is the culture of curiosity and the sense of distribution and miscellaneousness that really kind of inherits the movement, inhabits the sense of movement of this object. So who is Dr. John Covell, for example? Who is the gift giver in this case? John Covell was a master of Christ's College, Cambridge. He was an antiquarian. He was a student of religion, of Eastern religion in particular, and we don't know how he came by this strap. Somehow from the West Indies, Covell acquired this object and gave it to Sloane. Sloane then took it into his collection, in his private collection in his home, which doubled as his museum in Bloomsbury, and then gave it to James Salter, who ran Don Soltero's coffee house on the west side of London in Chelsea, and displayed it publicly in his so-called coffee room of curiosities. And that's a really interesting site, S-I-T-E. That's a really interesting site, a coffee house. Of course, a place of exchange, place of commercial exchange, news, gossip, projecting, imperial trade, imperial speculation. But this site is also interesting because it was very much contested. There were those who went to Don Soltero's, run by this man Salter, who perhaps had been a gentleman's servant of Sloane's. And some people took Salter's collection as a genuine museum. Zacharias von Offenbach wrote in 1710, "Standing round the walls and hanging from the ceiling are all manner of exotic beasts, such as crocodiles and turtles, as well as Indian and other strange costumes and weapons." So for some people, this is a curiosity cabinet and a space in which it is possible to have knowledge of exotic things. But Isaac Bickerstaff in the Tatler objected to the kind of bastardization of virtuosic taste by this lowly servant, Salter, aspiring to the role of virtuoso, charging money for paying customers to see his objects in this commercial space, this non-private, this publicizing space. "I cannot allow a liberty he takes," wrote the fictional Bickerstaff, "of imposing several names on the collections he has made. He shows you a straw hat, which I know to be made by Madge Pescad within 3 miles of Bedford, and tells you that it is Pontius Pilate's wife's chambermaid's sister's hat." So there's always a question about the provenance and attribution and the itinerary of such things. And here is a space that's under a lot of pressure in terms of credibility, in terms of trust. So that's a very interesting element of the kind of English itinerary of this manatee strap. It's in a very unstable space, at least from the point of view of some. In this coffee house. What I want to stress, I think, is really the form of these lists that you see before you. And what I want to kind of close by really emphasizing is a difference that takes place in the handling of objects and artifacts pertaining to slavery and slave trade in the 18th century, and a shift from what one might call distribution to assembly. And my suggestion here is that what we see in both these lists, the register of accumulation and the published list of Don Soltero's, is not, I think, an attempt to assemble slavery as the category to which such a thing would inevitably point. Or in other words, what is not being assembled overall in Don Soltero's is an attempt to represent, depict, show something of slavery. Given the intermixture, the kind of pell-mell intermixture of curiosities here, that I think is paralleled by Sloane's, in a sense, biographical, over time, developing registry of things that come into him. So I really want to de-emphasize the notion that Sloane is deliberately, or Salter, deliberately assembling a set of objects to point to slavery. There's very interesting timing here. I mean, this is the early 18th century, not the later 18th century. And so there's no thoroughgoing, unavoidable political debate about slavery, slave trade, or abolition at this time in the same way that there will be, certainly from mid-century, but absolutely, of course, from the 1780s. So I think one thing that's important to stress here is the way in which Sloane does accumulate a number of other objects, remarkable objects. I think this is a unique collection for the early 18th century, objects pertaining to slavery that are also listed in the catalogue of miscellaneous things. These objects include not just the manatee strap, but a Barbary scourge with which the slaves are beaten, made from a palm tree, a noose made of cane, split for catching game or hanging runaway Negroes, a bullet used by the runaway Negroes in Jamaica, a coat of the runaway rebellious Negroes who lived in the woods of that island, and also the manatee strap. All of those items are gifts. He has sent anatomical specimens from, for example, John Burnett, a Scottish surgeon working in Cartagena as the South Sea Company, slave trading company surgeon, sending him African body parts as surgeon for the South Sea Company in the early 18th century. He has sent in the 1730s from Gloucester County, Virginia, from John Simmer, some samples of stones that Simmer has surgically removed, as he puts it, from the vagina of a Negro girl. He sent to Sloane unsolicited as a way to try and start a relationship with the great London collector, patronizer of those with curiosities to be sent into the Imperial Centre for the Virtuosos collection. So there's a really interesting aspect in which it's the agency and generativity of the peripheral actors that is helping to constitute these collections. And these suppliers are clearly attributing and defining in their minds what it is that Sloane would find curious and why. So this is really the question that pertains also to the whip. In what particular way is the manatee strap a curiosity worth giving to Sloane? There's a lot of things one could say about the strap and what a whip would have signified in the early 18th century. I don't have time to go into all of those, but I will briefly draw your attention to the fact that this was not an ordinary or quotidian whip. It was a very particular whip. Sloane actually wrote about it briefly in his Natural History of Jamaica, Volume 1, 1707, and he says the following. Again, this is in print. This is not in the context of displaying the object, so I want to insist that we not make things add up, object and text-wise, in an over-hasty manner, and to kind of follow the distribution of texts and things rather than assume their connectedness. So what Sloane says in 1707 about this object that he has received is as follows: beating with manatee straps is thought too cruel, and therefore prohibited by the customs of the country. The cicatrices are visible on their skins, on the Negroes' skins, forever after, and a slave, the more he have of those, is the less valued. So it turns out that what's curious about this strap is not its quotidian instrumentality, but it has a kind of curiosity status because it is illicit, because it has been banned. And, following on from some of the extremely interesting thoughts Kim and also Neil presented to us yesterday, there's a way in which this strap is peculiarly curious because, at least in this literary presentation, Sloane is positioning it as something that undermines the instrumentality of the violence of the slave regime. It's something that devalues the slaves either by overly marking the particular bodies of slaves that have been beaten with it as overly recalcitrant and therefore problematic, or simply as a sign of a weakened physical constitution based on being disciplined by this particular strap. So there's a number of things that one could try to say about what this strap would have signified in this early 18th century period in London. And maybe in the discussion we can talk more about that. Although, again, I want to come back to the idea that it's wise here to pay close attention to the itinerary and the distribution. None of the things that Sloane collects that pertain to slavery he ever assembles into a part of his collection that is about Jamaica or Africa or Negroes or blacks or slavery. Those aren't his categories. His categories are miscellaneous things, anatomical curiosities, botanical specimens, some of which derive very directly from interaction with slaves. So finally, I'll just make the contrast and then show a couple of images with the abolitionist rewrite, in a sense, of a lot of these collecting behaviors. And what I'd like to suggest is that it's very interesting to see how a very deliberate strategy of abolitionist collecting sheds light on what Sloane had really not been doing, I think, in previous period, as well as drawing attention to what goes on in the late 18th century. So it's abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson in particular, but into the 19th century, William Knibb, the Baptist missionary, who make much of not simply collecting such things, but putting them together in a set that points specifically to the abstract slavery as a moral category, as that which is to be identified as a kind of moral target, as opposed to simply pursuing what I think Sloane was doing, which in some ways was a kind of Lockean project in the natural history of man. So Clarkson writes about the horrible facts of slavery. He identifies Africa very clearly as the place to be concerned with, rather than simply the more pragmatic question of plantation labor. He, as is very well known, in the 1780s, assembles a box of African trade goods, Clarkson's chest, that includes shackles, chains, instruments of torture, and presents these before Parliament. And it's extremely important here that the things themselves, the very instruments of slavery, be mobilized in a political and moral and legal context for arguing for abolition. There's a new theory here of the power of objects, not as curious things, multiply significant, I think, and problematically polymorphous from this abolitionist perspective that Sloane had mobilized, but here really an extraordinary belief in the power of objectifying these articles to speak specifically about the horrible facts of slavery as evidence, as facts. There's a kind of sentimental materialist epistemology at work in abolitionism through this objectification. Knibb in Jamaica years later organizes the mock in 1838, and the actual abolition of actual emancipation, organizes the burial of a coffin that contains chains, hence bury the chains. The importance of bringing back certain artifacts to move the British public, to move Parliament into legal action. Let me just very quickly then, to sum this up, just run you very quickly through some of these images, which I, in a sense, didn't want to dominate the talk, because I don't have a picture of the whip, I don't have a picture of the strap, so I wanted to at least talk and think about it before showing you these sort of distracting images. There's Sloane, we don't need to bother with him. There's a paparazzi attack on a bust of Sloane in the British Museum by Michael Reisbrach. This is Sloane's cacao specimen. He is credited with, this is from 1687-89 Jamaica, the right-hand page, all preserved to this day in the Natural History Museum, preparatory sketch on the left for the engraving in the Natural History of Jamaica. He is credited, in my view, falsely, heroically, for inventing milk chocolate. We can talk about that another time if you want. An example of one of these many thousands of pages of manuscript inventories and catalogues, his map of Jamaica. He traveled from Port Royal to St. Anne, from south to north on the right-hand side of that image. Title page from the voyage to Jamaica with Baconian dogma, many shall run to and fro and knowledge shall be increased, from the book of Daniel. An example of one of many thousands of boxes of vegetable substances, Jamaican pepper, a passage in which he describes the torture and execution of African slaves, which we don't have time right now to talk about, but maybe later. Here's Clarkson by comparison. Clarkson's chest depicted in the bottom right-hand corner of this image. You'll see it here. This is it in Wisbech Museum in Cambridgeshire in the UK. Botanical specimens to show that English people should trade with Africans, not enslave them. And here is a crucial example of Clarkson not having a distribution, but making it a very conscious assembly of shackles, of the speculum auris, to draw together images of the things. Of course, he actually had these items. These items seem to have been lost from the chest, but this is what he was presenting in public with extraordinary, in a sense, fetishistic self-consciousness. Neil Whitehead yesterday showed us an image of the slave ships. The point I'm making here is that it's not just about representation. It's very important to have things as a model that was actually built and presented to Parliament by William Wilberforce of this ship. So the three-dimensionality of this and the power of objects, there's something extraordinary going on with materialist epistemology for the abolitionists. This is very useful to, I think, make a final point, which is that we're talking about itineraries of exchange. We can ask very actively, I think, how are those itineraries visible or not visible in the things that we trace? The extraordinary thing that abolitionists did was to make objects like this, East India sugar not made by slaves, in a sense putting a moral geography into play, into inscribing them into the objects, by contrast with Sloane's connoisseurial act of provenancing. This is very different, I think, an experience of an object from, say, Sloane as the virtuosic connoisseur, explaining where things come from, not how they move, not necessarily deploying in the same way this sense that the abolitionists had, that there was a single moral geography in which British people were implicated through the slave trade in the Atlantic world. The provenancing gesture of the virtuoso, this comes from here, I think of rather more as a kind of distancing effect. And here finally is a whip stuffed into a bottle by William Knibb in the 19th century in Jamaica that exists to this day, that was taken back along with chains from Jamaica to mobilize abolitionist rallies in 19th century Britain. This is in the Docklands Museum in London, which I think is an absolutely extraordinary exhibit on sugar and slaves. And this, in a sense, is a kind of return, but in a very different guise, to this longer history of the circulation of artifacts pertaining to slavery. Sorry for going on so long. Thank you very much indeed.
And he's published several articles on related issues. He is presently preparing a book manuscript that explores this, and it's entitled A World More Concrete, Real Estate and the Remaking of Jim Crow, South Florida. And he will talk to us about the work pass.
Good morning. Everybody okay? It's too early to feel tired. Yeah. This has been a fantastic conference. Welcome to the 20th century. We're going to try to move swiftly. I wanted to talk about the work pass and in a way frame it by talking about borders that in fact do matter. And all the talk about transnationalism and all the talk about exchange, there are in fact boundaries that make a huge world of difference. And debates around immigration highlight this tremendously. The fact that the U.S. is governed under a different set of laws than its neighbors to the south, its neighbors to the north, to the east and west, makes a difference to folks who are willing to board rafts and travel to places like Florida. There's actually a way in which, in understanding the evolution of U.S. jurisprudence and U.S. law, we can try to make some sense of other ways, other contexts can use kind of race and capitalism and politics in hopefully innovative ways. I'd like to affirm the notion that land as the literal foundation of cultural contact is also the currency over which cultures clash. There are pro-growth cultures, cultures of representation, liberal statecraft, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to argue in this presentation that the work pass is an expression of narratives of place, both temporal and geographic, which also serve as narratives of race. And there are three ways I want to talk about narrative and the object at hand. Narratives of democracy and how those connect to surveillance, narratives about segregation and how that actually facilitates the emergence of the global city, and then narratives of erasure and the politics of preservation. Now, for South Florida, there's a lot that can be said that actually connects well to the early modern period. St. Augustine was an early modern city, a kind of outpost for the Spanish, and Florida moved between Spanish and English and Spanish and American hands. And it didn't become a state until 1845, where it met the constitutional requirement of number of white residents, which was 50,000. It was a territory in 1819 and couldn't become a state until it had the appropriate number of white people within its boundaries. And so from the very beginning, Florida is a space that is defined in legal terms and in cultural terms by whiteness. And the past becomes an expression of that in a much more kind of contemporary moment. Now, there are a number of ways in which the economy and the growth of Florida can be explained by tourism, real estate, and the vice industry, essentially. There's some great work on cocaine, for example, and how it essentially kept alive the real estate market during the 1980s. In Miami, about 85% of all the real estate bought in the 80s was purchased by drug money. But I want to focus only on the tourism and the real estate aspect and try to move swiftly as I do so. During the war, and I mean World War II, which is the only war that oftentimes matters to 20th century historians, there were a number of ways in which the United States was trying to change its image through a policy exerted by the Roosevelt administration called good neighbor Pan-Americanism, essentially. And the idea was that instead of having an overtly kind of imperialist strategy modeled on Theodore Roosevelt's notion of kind of the white race and the white man's burden, you have a kind of commercial empire and ultimately an empire of experience that would be facilitated through tourism that really did move in many respects out from South Florida. Miami becomes a really important jumping off point for good neighbor foreign policy. And the way in which the U.S. tried to redefine its relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean had in large measure to do with the way in which Miami was able to serve as a kind of bridge and a space for populations to move back and forth between the southern and northern hemisphere. This particular image is of shipping routes during the 1940s, and it's important not only because of what it allowed America to do in terms of its commercial relationships, but these shipping routes were actually targeted by Nazi submarines during the early parts of the U.S. intervention in World War II. Between 1942 and 43, there were 600 ships sunk off the Atlantic coast. And this created a tremendous amount of anxiety for folks in South Florida and truly throughout the country. There were actually fears, and I'm thinking now, I'm kind of moving ahead and thinking about Jim Crow segregation in South Florida as a space that's marked by white and black, kind of this color line. There were genuine fears that Jim Crow could not keep Nazi spies at bay, could not keep communist organizers at bay during the height of the Cold War. And so the ID card becomes a very useful way of actually forcing everyone to get on the books legally. In 1941, you essentially had memoranda sent between local law enforcement that wanted every worker that moved between the urban spaces, the kind of residential spaces of the city of Miami, and the leisure spaces of the Miami coastline, and particularly Miami Beach, to basically take a photograph, take a thumbprint, have their place of employment kind of scrawled. And this was a way of enforcing a kind of surveillance that Jim Crow in and of itself could not facilitate, right? If you have white Nazis who are potentially getting information from military installations in South Florida, how can you ensure that the person working at your table or the person who's cleaning your bedroom isn't in fact someone who's a foreign kind of spy? So there's a way that the ID cards help to fix questions of whiteness in a space that's defined by the color line. The other big problem that was facing South Florida were problems of technology. And in the article I submitted to Pre-Circulate, I talk about race as a technology in the same way that scientific knowledge is applied, racial knowledge is applied, and it's actually modernized again and again and again. And in order to understand the evolution of racism in the 20th century, you have to actually understand its relationship to other more concrete forms of technology. This is a map that was essentially used to publicize the proximity of Miami to the destinations of South America by way of Pan American Airways. And Pan Am is a huge corporation in shaping the fate of South Florida for reasons that I unfortunately can't get into now, but would happy to discuss during the Q&A. But just get a sense of the way in which Americans were able to access the Southern Hemisphere with a tremendous amount of ease, relatively speaking in historical terms, that was previously just unavailable. Likewise, folks are moving from South America and the Caribbean back into the States in ways that are unprecedented by virtue of aviation technology and innovation. boosters tried to sell Miami as being the gateway of the Americas, and so much of its kind of real estate fate was wrapped up in its ability to be in the minds of tourists, be they from the north or from the south, this kind of gateway between these two worlds. Just as some quick numbers, the city of Miami's news bureau in 1945 had a $50,000 publicity budget, and they basically published about 14 million words in 1,000 different newspapers throughout the Americas and Europe, selling the importance of South Florida. About 100 different magazines and articles and newsreels were published to echo the Bureau's efforts, and the advertising that was used by aviation companies is very instructive as to how they imagined South Florida to work in the broader hemispheric context. This is an ad from Delta Airlines that is basically trying to help people understand how to enjoy Miami, where Miami falls in the racial taxonomy of the greater Caribbean. I mean, it's pretty overt, for lack of a better word. Usually when I use it with undergraduates, I'll have to break it down, but I trust my audience to decipher what's going on here. In understanding Miami's place as a kind of tourist destination and the way in which the ID cards were a necessary way of policing whiteness and policing all workers, there's also a way in which we have to understand it created coloreds. And I use that term very deliberately. There is a distinction to be made between Negro as a legal category and colored as a social category. One of the problems presented by increased migration is not everybody who's coming from the South is going to look white and going to be able to really move in the old kind of Jim Crow order. And so coloreds became a tremendous problem because South Florida had to reach out to its Latin American brothers in the spirit of post-war Pan-Americanism. But what do you do with people who are coming from Cuba, who are coming from Dominican Republic, who are coming from places in Brazil? There were ways in which workers had to be essentially harvested and herded. And the pass evolves in its usage. Once the war is over, it no longer is used for policing all workers. It actually becomes a mechanism for policing and surveilling only black workers. So essentially what happens is a mechanism that is meant to provide a certain kind of stability becomes new. And it becomes an artifact of apartheid as opposed to simply an artifact of labor. And there are tremendous numbers of oral histories that talk about the curfews that were employed by the city of Miami. Basically, in some places, 6 p.m., 8 p.m., 10 p.m. curfews where blacks were not allowed to be on the coast at all, literally away from the water. Part of my work actually argues that the way in which you should understand race is, in many ways, by one's proximity to certain kinds of amenities. And the water, in the case of the U.S. and the East Coast, is one of those amenities that actually defines who is colored and who is not. It was made known to us in no uncertain terms, recalled a man named Joe Wheeler. You couldn't be caught in the white part of the city after dark. That was the way it was. We knew this. Peggy McKinney, who was a 16-year-old hotel worker, a laundress, said if you were stopped by the police, you had to show this card that you were coming from a workplace or whatever. It helped fix race within an environment that was utterly dependent on border crossings. This is an aerial photograph, and again, in a different context, I would love to talk about the power of aerial photography and the power of photographs as kind of verifiable documents, very different from what we've been talking about the last few days in terms of artwork, that is always about perspective, and it's always about argument, and there's always about power. Photographs are somehow more true. And this is an artifact of regional power and the way in which boosters were able to conceptualize region by their ability to literally take a plane into the air and snap photos and essentially come up with massive land projects. This is a map that I've modified just so you can see the downtown central Negro district. You have the Florida East Coast Railroad, which served as a color line since the late 1890s. And this main kind of black area basically expanded from blocks to neighborhoods. Now, Biscayne Bay becomes a great natural divide between black and white Miami, and to this day, the bay serves as a natural barrier, residentially speaking, between where most blacks and most whites live. And I'd also like to point out that the downtown is very close to the black district, in large measure because there was a huge dependence on service labor to really move from the Negro district into the downtown, and to cross those two very narrow causeways, it became quite easy to police who should be where when you have a bridge, essentially, as the only way to access the more exclusive side of town. This is a map that deserves, again, more attention, but essentially what I want to point to, and I want to see if I can get this pointer feature to work here. All right. When the federal government began subsidizing mortgages in the 1930s, they used it to fix economic value to real estate in much more deliberate ways than simply color lines. The red colors are blocks of essentially undeveloped areas or areas that have a black population. The green areas are those areas that are essentially on the rise in terms of their real estate value and have an entirely white population. Blue is also white, but areas that have topped out. Yellow are basically Jewish and areas that are on the downslide. And you can kind of see where it goes. Now, this little area here, this red area, is the kind of official rendering of the Central Negro District. And you can see by this map a little bit better just where Miami Beach was in proximity for those who haven't been to South Florida. And the causeways would essentially cross this leg here and then again up here for workers to enjoy the wages that they would basically gain through service. Here's an aerial of the Central Negro District, again taken by local planners. Now, what's interesting here is that this was a tremendously profitable space. So outside of tourism and the natural amenities that we think about, as far as palm trees and all of the kind of manufactured tropics that South Florida still tries to traffic, you have a tremendously profitable real estate market that's built in large measure on slum housing, and housing that is deteriorated but tremendously overpriced. And one of the statistics I like to quote, in 1950, one could have a dwelling of this quality for about $18.50 a week with a $100 deposit, no indoor plumbing, and several relatives to sometimes help you share the burden, about 18 bucks a week. For $17.50 a week, you could have access to a hotel room with a phone and access to a pool in the white part of town as a visitor, as a tourist. Segregation was absolutely a profit-generating mechanism. And by having confined real estate markets, there was a way in which, again, the idea of being colored had very material meaning, very material value for both the landlords themselves and for the folks who lived in those spaces and tried to claim ownership. This is just a really quick example of what real estate was worth in 1948, how density became the kind of watchword of the day. The more property you could pack onto a space, the more that space would then be worth. And the city needed this kind of density to generate taxes. These are basically tax assessments. And what I did was take the aerial photograph, zoom in, map on a tax assessment of those blocks and try to picture in some of those values. Ignore this. This is a different story around Goodbread Alley. I can't tell now. Old picture. So again, thinking about the card and the work that it does, it was useful for labor. It was an analog or a sister kind of artifact or a sister kind of mechanism to real estate itself in terms of the race work that it did. And it was also, and it is also, an artifact of apartheid. And this is the kind of last section I want to talk about a little bit in some detail. I found this source plastered in the pages of a 2,000-page oral history collection that was revolving around the displacement of blacks in the Miami downtown in the late 1960s. Miami is a place with a very scattered archive. I'm of the mind that archives are largely segregated along racial lines, particularly community archives. You have government archives and you have local quote-unquote black archives, and the Black Archives of South Florida, which is its official name, is where I found this document. And there's a grassroots archive that essentially exists in people's homes, under their beds, under their pillows, people keeping deeds of family property in file cabinets. The first black judge in South Florida's wife has essentially all of his court records in a back room in her house. He refuses to relinquish them. And there's a power to these documents. This particular image is one that was photocopied again and again and again and placed in the pages of a variety of documents. That's why the image quality is so poor on it. I mean, it should look like a regular driver's license, but it being copied again and again and again was a kind of image agency that local folks trying to remember the history of Jim Crow engaged in. There were a number of ways that the power of documentation was meant as a response to essentially being outflanked by liberalism and liberal statecraft. During the 1940s, there were ways in which blacks, American-born blacks, had to improvise with the color line. They would basically find ways, for example, of feigning a foreign accent so that they could make their way into exclusive spaces where Caribbean blacks, whether they from Haiti or from Cuba, were able to kind of squeak through, right? There wasn't, in the 1940s, a kind of rigid enforcement of anti-Haiti politics. That comes much later. And in the more modern period, improvisation becomes an answer to things like the building of expressways on top of black spaces. In the stories that people tell about Miami, the destruction of the Central Negro District, often known as Overtown, is a narrative of trauma. You couldn't fight it. The highway destroyed the cultural, spiritual, educational concept of the entire community. We lost our neighbors, we lost our friends, we lost our relatives. It was like death. It destroyed us. Another one. That expressway was the beginning of the end. They took my landlord's house and other people's houses in the name of progress. Now, the core of my book is about destabilizing the victim narrative while surveying the awesome fortitude of white supremacy and the speculative real estate-driven capitalism that is often its handmaiden. But I also would like to point that there's a way in which you can't access this narrative properly without engaging in a kind of field work. And in talking with local blacks who remember and talk about this history of displacement, there's an interesting narrative move that they make. They talk about over town, going over town. It's not over town in kind of a single word, but in fact, an action that was a reflection of black suburbanization, and more pointedly, middle-class blacks who had already left the neighborhood for better communities and trying to partake in the promises of the civil rights movement. There was a separation that desegregation allowed that ultimately left this area politically disempowered long before the bulldozers ever came through. But that's a narrative that doesn't get told in a very kind of black and white story about displacement and violence, spatial violence. There's also a narrative about police brutality. One of the most interesting rhetorical moves that we make in understanding the 20th century is this notion of the urban riot. In South Florida and much of the Sun Belt, there were what one might call suburban riots. And oftentimes what defines the space as being urban is only the presence of black bodies, but in most of the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you have in Watts, you have in Atlanta Summerhill neighborhoods, you have in neighborhoods in Kentucky, riots in the suburbs, where the promises of suburbia are not there to be realized. The infrastructure that people thought was going to meet them in these single-family communities just wasn't there. And the violence that ensues becomes a kind of poster child for the failings of the liberal state. So conservative politics like to point to the failures of the city, when in fact it was the failure of the suburbs that in many ways sparked violence. The politics of preservation are in some ways a response to the crack epidemic, to late 1960s riots in the 80s and 90s. And there's a politics of preservation that is absolutely informing the way in which the ID is used today. Folks literally still carry this card around. They deploy it at city commission meetings and in ways that are totally about trying to remind folks in South Florida of the Jim Crow history. Miami is a space that sells itself as being diverse. You watch CSI Miami, Miami Vice. It's all about the Caribbean flavor. It's all about everyone is multicultural, multilingual. It's all wonderful. It's still one of the most segregated cities in the country. And the power of space to essentially create narratives of victimization are still very much felt. And the ID cards are meant to kind of conjure a certain kind of narrative. Just real quickly working through these. The upper corner is an image of Cubans marching a cayocho in a very kind of nationalist fervor. And displacement is part of their story as well. Having real estate expropriated by Fidel Castro is a defining piece of the Cuban exile narrative, right? Then you have images of landmarking being done by Haitians, who in many ways are now framed as being the enemies of African Americans. Now think about the 1940s and the 1950s as South Florida being a space where Jamaican migrants came to work during the war. You had people coming in from Spanish-speaking Latin America, being forced many times by virtue of their skin color to live in the colored side of town. So colored spaces were tremendously diverse linguistically, in terms of cuisine, in terms of cultural practices. School yearbooks in the 1940s are being published in 2 and 3 languages in the quote-unquote colored side of town. But in the 1990s and in the 2000s, the politics of representation are very much about antagonism between West Indians, Francophone blacks from the Caribbean, and African Americans. The landmarking of Jean-Jacques Dessalines Boulevard is a kind of slap in the face to blacks who have been erased by urban displacement. The statue of Toussaint Louverture sits on the corner of Martin Luther King Boulevard in South Florida. Again, a juxtaposition of these kinds of politics of remembrance. The Overtown project, essentially the gentrification project to reinvigorate the Overtown neighborhood, is an attempt to preserve the growth politics that have come to define South Florida. But again, it's not just about gentrification, it's about historic preservation as being a weapon. One of the things that I've learned in trying to deal with local community groups is that landmarking is oftentimes the only weapon that local community people have left anymore, because so much of the city is constantly being redeveloped that you have to put your name on something and go through official kind of historic designation as a way of essentially stopping the bulldozer from coming. Oh, the zoom feature? Does it zoom back out? Hit the wrong button. Thanks, man. The way in which folks have tried to use historic preservation, the displacement of Overtown didn't happen without being widespread support on the part of middle-class blacks for using eminent domain law, using massive land initiatives as a weapon against slumlords and slum profiteering. It was an attempt in large measure by local blacks to appropriate the technologies of liberal state power. The origins go back in many ways to the attempt by blacks in Miami during the Jim Crow period to appropriate the power of the state in very deliberate ways. The founding of black police in the 1940s was meant to be a way of helping the community, quote unquote, uplift itself. There's a kind of divide that was necessary for this politic to work. Thinking about that notion of colored as a social category and Negro as a legal category. There were only Negro police officers, only Negro judges. To become part of the liberal state, you had to be a citizen. And so from the very beginning, the attempt to claim power on the part of folks under the yoke of Jim Crow forced a kind of bifurcation of quote-unquote colored identity. Coalition politics are very difficult to execute when the legal terms under which the parties are operating are in fact very different. As a different story, oftentimes Jamaicans during the war times at least had a much better labor relationship than local African Americans did because they were British subjects and they had the British Empire essentially behind them, in a manner of speaking. The attempt to use liberal technology while in many ways being outflanked by liberalism, right? Displacement, erasure, is unfortunately part and parcel of the story to be told about Miami and America, for that matter. The horses here were bought by a local community, and I had to include this image because there was a way in which blacks with badges and guns riding white horses had a very real symbolic value. One could argue that Barack Obama is a new Negro riding a white horse to save the country. In closing, I want to make a couple of points about cultural contact and how I'd like to think through it, and I know I only have about 3 minutes, if not less. Migration, first and foremost, demands that we desegregate our scholarship. And this is a problem that regrettably isn't just in the United States, with all the talk about Jim Crow and the like. Segregation in many ways looks like, quote unquote, diversity. It looks like area studies. In many ways, our departments at our respective universities look, to use James's language, like cabinets of curiosity, where you can essentially access difference in a very safe environment. College students always want to interrogate white privilege in the college classroom, but on the street, it's a very different kind of space, a very different kind of conversation. So I would argue that, one, diversity is a discourse of white supremacy. Two, that the ID card is an artifact of a pre-diversity Miami that folks are trying to preserve. It's interesting because in 2010 census, the word Negro is now appearing, and it's a response to blacks who lived during this period to reclaim that term and recognize that history. We need a better biracial model, one that understands the difference between white and black. And what I mean there is not about skin color, but white being the way in which the state treats property. There's something to be gained by tracking the evolution of race and tracking the way in which it works concretely through space. And I would, again, encourage all of us in our training of students to bridge these divides. There's an unfortunate gap between African American studies and Native American studies, for example. The history of Florida collapses that divide. Again, even in this context, in this presentation, I've made the egregious point of segregating. But there is actually a Native American story to be told about Seminoles and that story in contemporary South Florida, not just in kind of a bottle. So I want to leave you with that idea of thinking about desegregation, thinking about cultural contact. Yes, and thank you for your time.
The final paper is by Wendy Roth, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at UBC. Her interests are in how social processes like immigration, intermarriage, or interpretations of new technologies challenge racial boundaries and transform classification systems. She's the author of many articles on race, migration, and ethnicity, and is working on a book manuscript that looks specifically at how migration affects the racial identities of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. And she'll be talking about Limé dolls.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here at this conference. Well, Nathan said, welcome to the 20th century. I suppose I'm here to welcome you to the 21st century, because my talk is going to be very contemporary. I'm coming from a sociology background, as Alejandra mentioned, and so I may be bringing a sort of different methodological processes to my work than perhaps some of the other ones on the panel or at the conference. But I thought I would start out by talking a little bit about these dolls, since we're focusing on objects here. These Limé dolls are an artisanal piece of folk craft that has become popular in the Dominican Republic very recently, in fact, only since 1981, when they were created by a Dominican artist, thank you, a Dominican artist by the name of Liliana Mera Limé. And they don't all look exactly like this. There's actually quite a lot of variety. But the one characteristic that they all have in common is that they're all faceless. And they often are shown in very sort of traditional dress, traditional poses, and so on. And the reason that they're faceless is to show the diversity of peoples, cultures, and ethnic groups that Dominicans come from. The idea here is that there is no one type of face that defines a Dominican, because Dominicans are a very mixed people with a huge variety of mixture of features and with roots from all over the world. So these dolls are in some way meant to represent the diversity of the Dominican people. And yet at the same time, here we see that there are dolls with very different skin colors and racialized characteristics, in a sense, in terms of the hair, texture, and so on, as well as the skin tone. So at the same time, there's a concept of race in the Dominican Republic, which is of a continuum, a sense of there being a variety of different races, phenotypes, and so on, and yet Dominicans are sort of all the same in the sense that there's so much mixture that that's what brings them together. There's no single type of face or characteristic that represents them all. I think that these dolls are interesting because they represent a very traditional way of thinking about race in the Dominican Republic and also in the other country that I looked at, Puerto Rico. And it's this idea of race being a fluid continuum. The idea that there are a variety of different mixes, types, skin tones, appearances between black and white, and that people really fall into this wide range of characteristics and appearances. And there's a huge range of classifications and labels that people use to represent race in these countries. So I also took the instructions quite literally to make this an informal talk, so I didn't bring a lot of slides, but one slide that I could have shown you is a list of a huge number of terms and labels that are used to describe different sort of racial appearances in these countries, from blanco y negro to mulatto, mestizo, jabao, just a wide variety that represents a different combination of facial features, hair types, skin colors, and so on. And another thing that's distinctive about this way of thinking about race, particularly in comparison to the United States, is that it's based on appearance and also social status. So there's an idea that somebody quite successful might be seen as lighter or whiter than somebody who is not from a very successful background. Now, think about this in contrast to the way that race is thought about in the United States. There we have a very inflexible dichotomy between black and white, at least traditionally so. And it's primarily based upon this concept of the one-drop rule, the idea being that anybody who has any amount, even a single drop, so to speak, of black blood would be considered black. So there's a huge variety of people who fit into that black category. And the other distinctive thing there is that classifications are based on ancestry rather than appearance. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea of passing, the idea being that somebody who looks quite white can pass and try to be in that category by people not knowing their ancestry. The very idea there is that classifications are not based on appearance, are not based on physical features. Otherwise, why wouldn't that person be considered white? So you've got two very different concepts of race, so to speak. And the project that I have been quite interested in here is thinking about the context of migration and how migration from the Caribbean, from these two countries to the mainland US, affects these concepts of race. So this conference is about cultural change that takes place through contact with others, and international migration is obviously something that provides a huge opportunity for change. One of the things that was mentioned on the website is assimilation as a process of change. So one question that I had in thinking about this research was, is there a kind of a racial assimilation that goes on where people who are moving from one kind of society, one way of thinking about their race, come to a new society, and as a result of being there and interacting and being labeled by others, adopt a different way of thinking about race? At the same time, there could be resistance to that assimilation, possibly resulting in some hybrid forms, or it could result in an even stronger identification with the kinds of concepts and identities that people had in their home countries that is in some way reactive to people telling them what they are or how they're seen in this new place. So this is what I was particularly interested in. And I think that most theories of international migration do predict that migrants coming from overseas will experience some kind of cultural change as a result of being in a new society. And one component of this is race. So I was particularly interested in looking at concepts of race as a form of cultural change through the process of migration. Now, one thing that I do like to point out is that there are really multiple aspects of race as a lived experience. When we look at things like data that give us a breakdown of racial categories, we're only getting at one of those aspects, right? We're getting at, well, with modern censuses, what people say they are in terms of self-identification. So there's a self-identity component to race, but then you've also got a number of other things. You've got how other people see you, what you might think of as a form of observed race. You've got reflected race. You've got the way that you think you're seen by other people according to their standards, and often that has an influence on people as well. They begin to conform to those standards over time. You also have the race that you tell other people, expressed race, if you are asked, what are you, and so on. And I think it's important to make a distinction between these things. I had a conversation just at breakfast this morning talking about one of the players on the Red Sox. Many of you may be familiar with David Ortiz, sometimes known as Papi, on the a Dominican player on the Red Sox. Now, a lot of Americans would look at that player and would say, he's black. By our standards, he's black. So that would be a kind of an observed race. But part of the question here is this an identity that he also adopts for himself, or is there, in a sense, a conflict between those concepts, those racial concepts, that are brought together through migration? So one issue that I came across was that most studies focus on self-identification. And the question there is, do migrants adopt black identities in particular because that's how they're seen? But this doesn't really get at their whole understanding of race and their whole concept of what race is as a schema, so to speak, all the different categories and classifications. So what I did is I used a number of photographs of people who might typically be found in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, representing the range of appearances, phenotypes, and so on, partly to show you here some of the diversity. These are just a few of the photographs that I used. And I showed 20 images to people and asked them to identify the race of each person in their own terms, whatever terms they would normally use. The other thing that I did is I compared migrants and non-migrants in order to get a sense of what's going on back home compared with what's happening to migrants who are living in the United States and who have been there for varying amounts of time, to see if time plays a role as well. And what I fully expected to happen based on the literature and everything that I had read is that people would go from using these sort of continuous terms, mulatto, mestizo, jabao, and so on, to perhaps adopting terms like white and black after they had been in the US for quite some time. I'll give you a brief summary of what I found, because I was quite surprised to find that this was barely happening at all. And the reason that this was barely happening was not because people were resisting changing to Americanized concepts of race, but because they never had the continuous term to begin with. They really were not thinking about race and identifying people in terms of this continuum of appearances, which is so prominent in the literature. Rather, what I found is that people in the home country, and also after they moved to the United States, were thinking about race in a very nationalized way. So they would use a schema that represented race as nationality or pan-nationality, describing people as, for example, Mexican, Dominican, Puerto Rican, American, Jamaican. These were the categories that they used to describe race, as well as Latino, a kind of a pan-ethnic label. And I'm going to read for you a quote from one of my respondents. This is a 60-year-old Puerto Rican woman who lives in San Juan, describing why it is that she identifies herself as Puerto Rican, why her race is Puerto Rican as far as she's concerned. This is a woman who is fairly light-skinned with straight hair, and many people see her as white. It would be quite easy for her to say that she is white, but she doesn't. Instead, she claims this mixture of races, which she sees as so quintessential to identity in these countries. She says, many Puerto Ricans consider themselves a mixture of blancos, indios, and negros. I consider myself a mixture of blanca, negra, and maybe India. I don't consider myself mulata because mulatto is blanco and negro. I consider myself Puerto Rican, and the Puerto Rican is that. I asked her, Puerto Rican is blanca, negra, and India? And she says, yes. I don't know if I have India race, and I don't know if I have negra race. But if I look at myself in the mirror, I think that although I have, straight hair and I'm more blanca than negra, but I'm Puerto Rican. There's no way that I'm not Latina. So in this passage, what she's saying here is that the mixture is partly what is coming to characterize her. Very much like those Dominican Limé dolls, this mixture basically makes it such that she can't pick out any particular aspect of her background and so she chooses to represent this apparent but unspecified mixture as Puerto Rican. Another theme that was very common among many of the respondents is the idea that race is not defined for these countries. Again, like the Limé dolls, there are too many colors, too many appearances for all people to be represented under one description. And this is partly why nationality comes to be used to describe the race of everyone. This is a young Puerto Rican college graduate, again in San Juan, who explains why he sees Puerto Rican as a race. Puerto Rican is a race, at least in the sense that I believe the race differentiates itself from one of any other place because of the origins. When the island was colonized, the Spaniards arrived. They killed the Indios after mixing with them. Also, the Negros that they had brought over after the adjustment of the laboring population due to the Indians' death, and they mixed. So this race has basically mixed with the passing of time, left and right, all over. There wasn't too much exclusivity, with the exception of some regions, but in general terms, it's like that there's a mix. The mix is exclusive of Puerto Rico, and I believe that that is enough to constitute a Puerto Rican race. For example, it differentiated itself very easily from the vicinity, from Santo Domingo, Haiti, Jamaica. Now, you hear so much about these terms, this sort of continuum of racial terms and categories. These terms are still used, but when I asked people, what do these terms mean if you're not thinking about these as racial terms, people would say very explicitly that they distinguish race on the one hand from what they think of as color. And these terms represent simply color. They're your appearance, but they can't represent your race because race has to be something much more essential. It has to be something that gets passed down to you from your parents and that is somehow a part of an essential inner being. And I'm going to read a last quote from Pablo, who is also a Puerto Rican non-migrant in San Juan, who looked at a list of terms of this continuum that I showed him. And he claimed that a lot of these terms, such as trigueño, which is a very typical Puerto Rican mixed term, can't be considered a race. He says, I couldn't say that trigueño is a race, because I turn out trigueño depending on who the heck I've mixed with. For example, my brother, he's a very handsome prieto. My brother married a girl who was very blanca. My nephews, the boys, they turned out trigueñitos. But the girl turned out just like her mother, blanca, 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 beautiful, with dead straight hair. She could live very happily denying her origins. She could mix with those people who are very blancos and beautiful. But she's going to be on the lookout because her children could turn out with characteristics from their grandmother or from their grandmother's father, who were negros. So the fact that I can have at some point some skin tone doesn't classify me in a race. I can look completely blanco, but at some moment I'm going to have something that isn't within the features because I have something from negro that wasn't in sight. But it's there, latent, hidden but latent, and that it can be projected later on, and I can't control that. If you think about it, it's really very similar to the American concept of the one-drop rule. And yet this is coming out of people who have always lived in these sending societies and have never gone abroad. The fact that they're distinguishing the concept of color from the concept of race is part of what allows people to describe race as a continuum, but still not use this terminology as part of their racial concept. Now, I found that these identities were reinforced when people come to the US. And in particular, there was an exchange of ideas, such that migrants were moving to the US with these ideas in place. And when they got to the US, even though people were telling them you're black, you're white, it was also very possible for them to use this narrative of race to distinguish themselves from a black and a white identity, proclaiming themselves as Dominican or Puerto Rican, or proclaiming themselves as Latino, as their race, by drawing on this narrative. And because there were boundaries established between them and other groups, other people as well would use these categories to describe them and reinforce the concept that this is who they were, that this was how they were seen in racial terms. At the same time, the experience of being pan-ethnic, of thinking of yourself as Latino, as that as part of your race, was very much an experience that developed in the US as part of the process of migration, as part of the process of coming together with other groups. And thinking about itineraries of exchange and how exchange takes place, what I found is that there was really a transnational process of back and forth between migrants and non-migrants, especially around the concept of pan-ethnicity, but also about an awareness of how members of their group are seen in a US stage. And the main ways in which this took place were, first of all, through a globalized pan-ethnic media. Many of you are probably familiar with television networks like Telemundo and Univision. And a lot of these programs that are on these shows, programs that are now shown throughout Latin America, as well as for Latinos in the US, try to instill a sense of being pan-ethnic because that expands their market share. They can show their programs to more people in the US and also throughout Latin America. So this idea of we're all being part of the same group gets communicated back to the home countries. Secondly, through what are known as social remittances, communication that goes back and forth between the migrants and the non-migrants. People in the US sending messages back about what it means to be Latino, how we are seen as Latino, and how our race here is, we're seen not as blacks, but as Dominicans, because that's what we insist on being. And then finally, the third process, and I have some great quotes about all of these processes, but I don't think I have time to read it. I'm happy to talk more about it, is simply the awareness of migrant communities abroad. The diaspora is a very omnipresent place and figure in people's minds. So the idea that migrants in the US are constantly aware of the salience of boundaries between them and Americans is transferred back to the home countries. And that boundary, that process of making these boundaries very salient is something that non-migrants become aware of even before they move. So instead of Dominicans using Haitians as their category of reference and thinking of themselves as light and mixed in comparison to their black neighbors on the other side of their island, their reference group becomes Americans. Their reference group becomes how Dominicans are seen in the US by Americans, in part, because of the exchange and the awareness that's going on back and forth between migrant and non-migrant communities. So, in conclusion, I'll just wrap up by saying that to evaluate whether there is really a process of assimilation around concepts like this, like race, towards the schema that's used in a new society, it's important to compare migrants and non-migrants, not just to look at what's going on among the people who move, and also to look at the entire racial schema, not just how they identify themselves, but how do they classify other people? What do they think other people should be called in terms of race, to get a sense of what are the categories that apply? What is the map of their concept of race in their minds? And secondly, the other thing that I want to point out is that there are multiple ways of constructing and understanding race, even within a single nation, even within a single community. There were differences between pan-ethnicity and nationality. There were differences between education groups to a certain extent in terms of people's willingness to adopt the schema in the society they moved to. And migration is part of the process that allows this multiplicity of racial concepts to exist in a single society, because it's bringing people together, it's allowing new groups in a community to maintain their old ideas and to coexist with other people who have a different concept of race. So I think that that is something very important to remember, that we don't simply have a single way of thinking about race in every society, but that through itineraries of exchange, there is an interaction and an intermingling of multiple concepts. Thank you.
I'm not going to go on for very long. I just have a few things to talk about to try to put them together. And then I guess, where's Neil? Is he gone? Oh, there he is. Should we bring the chair, put the chairs up and after I'm done and ask questions? Okay, so that's what we'll do. So I'm going to dwell on the objects because I found them fascinating, and because together they made me think about exchange and value and what Caribbean scholars call creolization. And these things reminded me of Bill Moore's argument about the notion of the fact And he makes the point that the root of the word actually means to make, so as in factory or manufacture. So a fact is something that is made both discursively and materially, if you will. And he argues that this idea of the fact that can be made commensurable with other facts, as we were talked about yesterday a little bit, emerged actually in conjunction at the very same time as the heyday of the system of circulation and exchange that made people into things. So slavery and the system of slavery and the way it rendered humans commensurable and measurable in value and exchangeable for goods or other commodities arose at the same time as the notion of the fact. And he argues that these arose together is not a coincidence. And it seems to me that each of the papers deals in some way with a legacy of that moment in which these two things emerged. The first thing I noticed about the objects actually was that their power derives not wholly from looking or from looking at or reading them, as a lot of the objects yesterday did with the maps and the images and the paintings. And the visual image is certainly there, but they're also, these objects in particular are designed to be held, and it's nice actually that we're doing this session in the museum. I think it seems very fitting. But they were designed to be held and handled, possessed, or even played with in the case of dolls. And so there's a kind of tactile history and a history of use and utility that becomes really important. And what the difference it makes, whether an object is largely visual or intended for handling, is perhaps something that we can discuss later. But they also share or resonate in different ways with three different themes that I've been thinking about. One is fixity or stillness, and in particular, and then the second is violence. And I'm really interested in the way that those two are related, and these objects are really speak to that relationship. And finally, the archive, which is more or less an organized or less organized collection of facts. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about these themes and the way that the objects relate to them. So, stillness. In all of the talk of itineraries and exchanges and routes and maps, all of that can leave one a little bit dizzy. And I went back to Sidney Mintz, who pointed out that what people call creolization actually requires a certain amount of fixity. It requires stillness. Creole culture, he argues, after all, is what was created when slaves had arrived in the Americas and were forced to stay there. So each of these things is actually about stillness somehow. Nathan raised that, in his talk a little bit when he talked about the way that the work pass allows for kind of restricted movement in a system predicated on the creation of spaces that people were supposed to inhabit and stay in. And crossing a boundary was such a problem that they had to create an entire bureaucracy with the photographs and the fingerprints and the cards, all of that fixing the identity of someone and constraining their movements as much as possible. And this is a kind of violence insofar as it forces people to live in places that they might not choose to live, and insofar as mobility and freedom were very closely related at the end of slavery, and lack of mobility was one of the primary features of slavery. And in addition, as he talks about more, perhaps in the paper than in the presentation, although you did mention that in the paper, is that in the presentation is that this diverse range of people is converted into a set of statistics and a racial classification not of their own making. So there's a kind of violence in sort of reducing people to this little card. In the case of the dolls, which I found really fascinating, there's also a fixing in the range of diversities and compressing them into three separate categories. And in that sense, I wonder the extent to which they pose a problem to the argument, in the sense that they hold to these three categories rather than to the more kind of fluid thing that and ineffable kind of system that you were talking about. But the dolls also create equivalences, and what was interesting to me about them is that everything, so much about them is the same, right? That their clothing was very similar one to the other, so there's no kind of class there, and there's a kind of they spoke to me about a kind of fantasy about racial harmony that reminded me of the casta paintings, in which tried to fix, which were painted in the 18th century Mexico, which tried to fix and render understandable a variety of New World species of races, if you will. And those dolls really seem to be kind of putting people in these categories in these very interesting ways. But there's seems to be a great deal of violence in the erasure of facial features. I mean, that's really, really striking. And they're left out, according to their maker, because the variety is so great that it's unrepresentable. And that, so the relationship there of the violence and the stillness is really remarkable, I think. The whip or the manatee strap is perhaps the easiest to fit into this scheme, as it's used to keep people in a state of submission and to fix their subservience as an instrument of violence that will keep slaves in their place, so to speak, in the hierarchy and on the plantation. And that's very clear. But the whip also raised for me a question about the rubric that James insisted on very persuasively, which is curiosity, and whether curiosity can include violence. What is the place of violence in curiosity and collecting? And I found in other work that I've read by James on wonder and electricity, I think lurking in there are questions of violence, and I just was hoping to push James a little bit more, and I'm very persuaded in the argument that the collector is perhaps not the only agent, and that the collection is not a collection about slavery. But I really wonder, what is the place of violence in those kinds of collections? If violence is a kind of currency, perhaps, for the people, the senders, that the senders are using to persuade Hans Sloane that this is an important or relevant artifact. And it leads to the question of the place of violence in the collection and in the archive, which a collection may or may not become an archive. And perhaps the relationship between the collection and the archive is something we might want to bring up and think about what's at stake in the difference between a collection and an archive. In the case of the passes, the link seems to be quite direct. The pass will become part of an archive, hopefully, right? Or in the end, perhaps the passes are somewhere in these archives. And a collection of paper, as Bruno Latour points out, is what creates categories, right? So that each little piece of paper side by side turns into a file that allows for the imagining of something like a culture or a society or a race. And in that sense, is the commensurability of each of these passes what's crucial. By the same token, the passes were really fascinating for me, because the passes that control and monitor and movement and access to wages, they actually do something, but then they become the very thing with which we learn or try to learn something about these people. So I found them very fascinating in terms of the relationship of the collection and the violence and the archive itself, where they end up. The dolls actually seem to be a counterpoint to this, because they're commodities, which may in fact be the opposite of an archive. If you think that an archive is presumably a collection of originals or things that can't be reproduced without losing some sense of authenticity, the dolls are made precisely to be reproduced and copied and multiplied and sold as souvenirs or whatever. And in fact, by doing violence to the faces, they refuse to archive Dominicans in a certain kind of way. My own object, how do I get there? This? Okay. My own object becomes part of this conversation of the relationship between violence and the archive, or the production of knowledge, in a literal sense that's not so easy to contemplate. And this is a radio. I don't know how well you can see. It's a radio that was used in the U.S. occupation for Haiti. It's a portable army wireless set, so they would actually transport these into their little camps on the backs of burros, actually, and set them up and use them to communicate among Marines, or and also to generate radiograms about events or orders or observations. And then those radiograms will become the archive of what we know about the occupation. But so in a sense, the radio is a kind of a generator of truth about the occupation, or facts about the occupation. But there's another way in which it's related to truth and to facts, which is that the radio itself was used to torture Haitians during the occupation by actually taking the wires and connecting them to Haitian bodies and running electric current through them in the course of interrogations. So as a way to get them to tell the truth about whatever it was that the people wanted to talk about, a way to get them to talk. And there's actually a very kind of striking connection to the manatee strap, although the opposite way. One of the attractions, apparently, of using electricity for torture was that it was what they call clean torture, so that it didn't leave any marks, so that you could torture black bodies and not have any evidence that they had been tortured. So that's so in a funny kind of way, all of these objects are related in this network of truth and violence and archiving. And what one comes away with is a question about itineraries of exchange or global encounters. Is there a method, I wonder, to Neil's madness? Does thinking about objects animate a methodology in which violence and the production of knowledge are brought into closer proximity with one another? And what's at stake is perhaps not the degree of mixing, quote unquote, but the genealogy of that very idea and its history in different times and places. Thank you. How much time do we have?
I think we're already over.
We're over? Yeah. Okay, we'll take about 15 minutes. Oh, Neil's already gone, so we can take as much time as we want. Okay. All right, questions? Yes, Florence?
I want to follow up on one of Alejandra's comments to James, namely that if we suspend the identity of the collector in the case of Sloane, what you've given us, I think, is a really interesting perspective in which Sloane looks less like a center of accumulation, which of course he is, but he also functions as a kind of nexus for itineraries of exchange. And you pointed to these peripheral actors in Virginia and in other parts of the world sending items to Sloane, who in turn gives some items to other people as well. And so, one of the things that occurred to me is that you have an agency in these peripheral folks, but then you also have Sloane and I think also Salter functioning as kind of passive agents in the sense that they're poles of attraction, right? I mean, these peripheral people in Virginia or whatever are thinking, what would Sloane like? And Sloane perhaps thinking to himself, what are items that maybe I have 10 of these and I can give one to Salter, or maybe this is something that's insufficiently curious or virtuosic. Whatever my standards of construction are, they don't meet mine, but maybe Salter's will be appropriate. And so my question is basically in thinking, instead of thinking of Sloane as center of accumulation and rather as a nexus of exchange, is it possible then to maybe try to articulate economies or maybe sub-economies of exchange in which you can use these maybe passive agents as kind of indices to, who gets what, or what kind of objects are appropriate to whom, or for what audiences, that sort of thing. A little bit of form, but you get the general.
Should we keep going?
No, I think we can do one at a time for now, yeah.
Like Frank Sinatra. Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I did it my way. Thank you, Florence, and thank you, everyone, for an incredibly stimulating panel, and Alejandra for your comments. Yeah, I think let's do it. Let me try to say this really briefly. It's not a Hal Cook story. So it's matters of exchange and it's commerce, but within that there's a gift economy, and there's another kind of logic of exchange, which is patron-client, which is these peripheral agents who are, for goodness sakes, a surgeon in the South Sea Company in Cartagena, direct access, trying to broker that supply of anatomical specimens into career advancement through Sloane, which he absolutely does. There's a wonderful example, and I have an image of it, but just think of it in your mind, a beautiful silver cup that says on the cup, this is from the 18th century, from Sir Hans Sloane to my honoured friend John Bartram. The person who made that cup was not Hans Sloane, it was John Bartram. John Bartram, the Pennsylvania botanist who supplied Sloane with a number of specimens. Sloane sort of thanked him for these and gave him a bit of money, and Bartram said, "Can I make this cup up as a gift?" And Sloane said, "Okay." So the supplier collects the collector into a form that is that demonstrates enlightened affiliation, relationship across long distance. So all of those, as it were, rather dead actors from the British Museum historiography point of view are all alive and kicking and interacting very locally with plants, with live human beings, with dead body parts, and it's very much part of a patron-client relationship where, passive agents at the center, as you put it. That's not a bad way of trying to juggle the sense of their brokerage. But what I really want to emphasize is how many gifts there are, how unsolicited a lot of this material is. And it's interesting, the Sloane image is not the image of Joseph Banks, who is very often represented with, Pacific garb draped around him pantomimically to really embody his exotic travel. Sloane, you saw very briefly that image, the august president of the Royal Society. There's that one level, which is, again, as a shorthand, the Anne Goldgar level, the Republic of Letters. And then there's the way in which Sloane connects very actively to all these other kinds of interlopers, traders, traffickers, and he's really kind of being nourished by the collections, such as they are, being nourished by that kind of level as well. And clearly some people, in the correspondence, recognize this and make the identification. I should have mentioned also that Sloane marries a Jamaica widow, Elizabeth Langley Rose, derives income for about 30 years from plantations in Jamaica. He's got a lifelong Jamaican West Indian correspondence network. So people know that, and people ask him, how do I get into the sugar trade? Hands. So there's all these different registers to who this guy is.
Okay.
Markham example is a great example of a regifting gone wild there.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I have a question for Nathan and more comment for James. So Nathan, it was really...
I've always wanted to do this.
Now it's a talk show.
It's Jerry Springer.
Is it on?
Is it just recording in the archive?
I don't know. Is this on?
No, should be.
Okay. Nathan,
No?
so my question...
The suspense is killing me.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about the archives.
Okay.
So you're talking about I'm really intrigued by the grassroots archive and the Black archive. And I wanted to hear some more thoughts from you on how objects in the archive have different sorts of agency. So you mentioned the agency of the work pass that is indexically signaled by the fact that it's copied over and over. How does that object agency differ than, say, an object that's kept under a mattress and is only taken out in very particular ways on particular occasions and for particular kinds of viewers? So I was hoping you could just elaborate on that.
It's a great question, and one that actually helps to shed a little bit of light on the power of archivists themselves. I mean, this work pass was so misfiled, I can't even tell you. I mean, so many of even the community archives that I use are essentially kind of a box that will say police, another one that will say, personalities, and you just kind of have to go in. I mean, it's kind of like these weird 17th and 18th century kind of repositories, right? But this is in the 21st century. And they're underfunded and can't catalog and can't digitize, and so there's another conversation to be had there. So the past, like I said before, I came across by accident. I mean, I got this oral history source that was literally 2,000 pages already transcribed, which for anybody who's ever tried to do oral history knows That's, saved me 6 months of just transcription time, much less kind of interview time. And I got them for that, but then as I'm rifling through, the past was just kind of there as one of the pages. And so I kind of excavated it from that collection, and then it became something that was used. Now, in the context of Miami's politics, there's a very interesting kind of generational dynamic of folks who literally have kind of firsthand eyewitness knowledge of Jim Crow life, and then who also have this documentation, which oftentimes, almost always, are documentations about kind of property ownership. And again, property in the most broad sense, which is kind of history as property and memory as property, and whether or not the state will recognize that is always at issue. And so in terms of the property debates, and I'll just share a quick anecdote, I had an interview, basically, or a meeting with a historic preservation group called the African American Committee of the Dade Heritage Trust. And never mind, they were all descendants of Caribbean immigrants. They had to be known as the African American Committee to set themselves apart from the Haitians who had their own landmarking initiative, right? And at this meeting, a woman by the name of Georgia Ayers presented a deed from 1896 of land that was owned by her great uncle that was hence renamed Little Haiti, okay? You kind of see where this is going. And unbeknownst to her, there was actually a copy of that deed already in the archives that I had photocopied and just threw in one of my file cabinets at home. And the idea was that we were going to have an oral history workshop, and she was going to bring this document as a way of generating conversations about the long-standing black history of South Florida. And so thinking that I was doing her a favor and seeing how fragile this document was, I said, don't worry, you can actually leave that document at home. I have a copy of it. We can bring that to the workshop instead and conduct a workshop around that. And I almost got thrown out of a 6-story window. And she said, "You don't have this document." There was a clear sense that the power and the authority that she had to do with this particular piece. Mm. And it's always in these theaters of, again, school board meetings, naming schools after, founders of black churches or ministers. That's where the currency of the archive becomes really useful, because in a city like Miami that is constantly suffering from redevelopment problems, oral history and these weird kind of documents that are floating everywhere are oftentimes the only remnants of actual spatial histories that are, just don't exist anymore. So hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, that does. And can I just, James, I had a few comments. One thing that it seems to me is that although these things are gifts, it might help to think of it as a tribute economy, because after all, there isn't a poison in these gifts. There's not an expected reciprocity over time. So it really seems to map for me more clearly into the whole idea of fruits of empire that are traveling from the colonies to the metropole, and could be seen in that way. And then in the material you presented on the abolitionists, it also seems to me that some of those practices of making the story of the violence of abolition concrete, wittingly or unwittingly, then occlude or erase the history of indenture. So when you get that image of sugar not made by slaves, it immediately raises the question of who is then making the sugar, and the politics around those sorts of erasures.
The second point is a very interesting one. The first point I disagree. I think reciprocity is often the target for these would-be clients, and it can take many different forms. It will often take the form of advancement with other people who give specimens. There's an exchange in duplicates, things like that. So although in a sense a lot of these people are of vastly lower status, they do successfully garner from Sloan some kind of responsiveness that's actually has a very big impact on their social trajectories. They come to London, they're received, this kind of thing. So I disagree with that. I think it's a very active network in that sense.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Great papers, and I'm just prompted to try and say something, that might be relevant to all the contributions and draw together some of the themes that really struck me, including in your contribution. So, I would like to say something like, in that case, archives are machines for making facts. And I think we're agreeing here, we can see very clearly that how those things are formed, whether it is the sort of list of curiosities whether it is the parallel informal archives, or indeed whether it is a sort of archive in becoming, which the dolls might be. So we see the space there for, you know, optimism. We can understand that these things therefore give us greater kinds of access. We're able to put the slave whip in a context which now allows us to read the purposes of contemporary collecting in a way, past collecting, despite the absence of collectors, in a context which makes then problematic the moment that we're in. And I say problematic because the archives, even the parallel and informal archives, seem to me to, you know, all be dedicated to a sort of idea of knowledge that, for the purposes of this panel, is heavily biologized and has been learnt from the vocabulary of the conqueror. So that even as we happily see the pluralization of the possibility for making other facts through other machines, I think very much the next stage of work, the question you raise, which I think is really difficult to deal with, how do you then, as it were, leave behind the categories of, you know, blackness, indigeneity, Latino, whatever, in order to find that great golden hill of new kinds of history, while at the same time communities, persons are so heavily invested in those very categories. So I guess my question is, can you help me? Because I think that's where many of us are, in trying to see a way of knowledge becoming more than the violence, or finally breaking with the violence, in which otherwise the archives which make that knowledge possible have been formed.
Yeah, right.
And anything else you can think of at the same time?
You know, I've pretty much made up my mind that I can't go back to South Florida once this book comes out. Really. Yeah, I mean, there's such a vindicative project to this that gets very difficult for folks to accept, for example, the existence of black property owners who allow homes to burn down around the ears of black children, right? You know, what do you do with the question? Again, for me, real estate becomes the real issue, because you have, and what I've noticed, you know, a kind of movement to step away from the state and have a really kind of drastic yeoman relationship with real estate that many people assume to be the kind of vestige of white conservative politics in the post-war period. You know, blacks shouldn't be advocating for property rights like libertarians, right? They shouldn't show up that way. They shouldn't be profiteering. They shouldn't be, you know, engaged in prostitution and vice and all these other kinds of weird things. And they should ally along racial lines, right? Why are these weird kind of factions emerging? And so I have to, almost in the interest of getting access to the grassroots archive, not offer full disclosure as to what it is I'm trying to do. I mean, I have to literally be deceptive just to get access to certain kinds of material. So don't attach my name to this online resource. So if folks want to Google me, they may come up and see how I'm like lying to my respondents. I mean, no, I'm kind of joking, but not. Yeah, so it becomes very difficult because I can't operate outside of the vindicative model that's been set, or whether it's asking quote-unquote elders of my community for documents, or even trying to go to conferences that are organized around Afro-American history. I mean, it's impossible. So, yeah, I have to do my best.
Well, I think I'm going to sort of draw on some of the issues behind that question and also pick up on some of the comments raised by Alejandra in my comments. I'm not an archivist or a historian, and in a sense, I liked the idea of finding an object that would anchor my talk in a metaphorical sense, much more than in a representative sense. And I do agree that I think that the objects which, you know, seriously were the only objects I happen to have in time for this talk do fall short of the reality of how people are talking and thinking. And in a sense, for me, what that raises, and which I think perhaps is partly behind the question, is, well, if these objects were to end up in an archive 50 years from now, what would they be missing? and they'd be missing quite a lot. The truth is that I don't see a set of Limé dolls that have 20 or even 10 different sort of types or appearances, not to mention the fact that none of them have the facial characteristics. And I think it's also worth pointing out in terms of the comment of violence that these dolls are always women. So when we talk about violence, I think that takes on a particular poignancy. But I do think that there is a problem with trying to understand a particular context or set of meaning around something like the concept of race, where some of that knowledge is lived and is not necessarily documented in objects that might end up in an archive. So I think, the Casta paintings are a great example of something that might be physical and something that could be kept and stored, but there's also a language around race, of how people talk to each other, of what they call one another, of the context in which you might call somebody mulatto as opposed to calling them negro, which is much more of an insult and was the sort of thing I only happened when people had fender benders and wanted to be hostile. How does that contextuality get preserved and kept? And I think that may be one area in which the archive might be missing something very important, and that's very problematic.
Am I also going to say something in response to Neil's question? I have to. What can I possibly add to that? Degeneration, I think, is probably what I want to say in a word, which is that this is a story of sort of moral mutation on everybody's part in the Caribbean. So we should not assume white versus black. Ned Ward's trip to Jamaica, circa 1700, the dunghill of the universe. This is a place where whites go to kind of kill themselves, trying to make money through sex, through alcohol, etc., through disease. They die in huge numbers. One of the interesting things in Sloane's Natural History of Jamaica is the way in which colour change is something that is much described as part of the curiosity culture. And that's white colour change as well. The way the skin changes because of voyaging, the way the skin changes because of diet. This question that Alejandra raises between violence and curiosity is a very interesting one. One almost is tempted to think back to, I think there are really violent objects in curiosity cabinets. There's weapons, there's kinds of relics going back of, so there's kind of, there's death, there's a martyrological element that's carrying over from the reliquary, perhaps, to the slaves. Now, of course, it's the abolitionists, as Marcus Wood has argued, who really stress the kind of paternalist, white Christian, redemptivist narrative about the suffering black body, and I obviously don't think that Sloane is doing that. But there's a sense in which I think curiosity and violence as kind of moral distance and moral extremity are linked here. Catherine Park, in the early part of Wonders in the Order of Nature, makes the point extremely well that curiosities are about topography, the topography of wonder. So there's a way in which I think the manatee strap is involved in a kind of provenancing, mapping of extremely violent spaces in which not only displaced Africans are implicated, but the moral degeneration of Creolizing Europeans and English enslavers is also very much bubbling around there. Sloane doesn't say a ton about that, but there's clearly a lot of literature at the time about the degenerating aspect of the Caribbean for the Europeans as well. So in that sense, it's not, the violence that comes through such an object can be seen perhaps more broadly, moving beyond Sloane's own treatment of it, as raising questions about who is implicated in this very much joined history of degenerative exchange. The whip is that which physically joins. It is the instrument of intercorporeal relation at its most extreme in upholding or possibly undermining the value generativity of the plantation order. So yeah.
Time for one more?
Yeah. Okay, Jessica and then Nika also. So
Yeah. Oh, so do them both together. Yeah.
I guess this is more in the way of a comment than a question, but it follows the the final two presentations as well as Neil's set of questions. But I was thinking about the whole way in which we talk about race and try to use it as an analytical concept and as a marker of identity, and to talk about it in a kind of academic way. Yet at the same time, we can never get away from the really inextricable relationship between race and racism, and that race itself is such a racist concept. And as much as we try to find ways to understand how people conceptualize race for themselves in ways apart from dominant ideology, at the same time, the very fact of those discussions and the kind of inordinate effort that people have to engage in to figure out who they are with respect to this concept, ends up speaking to its hegemonic power and really its violence in many ways. And this is a kind of iron cage that I don't see any way out of, but I wish there were one. And I guess I just wanted to raise the issue.
And one final.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed all of your talks. I think that the previous comment is along the lines of what I was going to say. There's so much study by quote, air quotes, white people on different things and who these people are and what I loved all of your presentations, but the dolls really struck me. I didn't see violence. I'm not challenging your perception, but I didn't see violence in the absence of a face. I saw that could be anybody then, and in the concept of race versus color versus self-identity, and were those dolls made by the people there? Yeah. So for them. I can't speak on their behalf, I have no idea, but in my concept, I was like, I liked that there were no faces because it could be anybody. If I went there, I could pick the middle one or the one to the left. I could go home and draw my own face on it. Also, this concept of the melting pot and the self-identity, which is separate from color and separateness also from lineage or blood, to a certain degree. I just would love it if maybe you could next time also do a study on a bunch of Canadians that appear white and let them self-identify what they are. Because I loved your exploration of that, so how to all of you.
Okay.
You guys want to, you have, yeah.
Just real quick, there's I'm kind of a materialist when it comes to this question of race. I mean, people have all these really interesting ideas and great ways of self-identifying, and oftentimes they're narratives of convenience, and we can kind of historicize those and interrogate those. Barbara Jean Fields draws a really fantastic distinction in an article called Of Rogues and Geldings, where it's almost as if ideas of race in the abstract are useless unless you're talking about racism. It's the process, it's the application, it's the making manifest of these ideologies in physical space and in real space that interests her and that interests me. I mean, I think self-identification is important, but again, when it comes to the questions of power, the marshaling of resources, the question of racism oftentimes makes it far easier to locate a certain kind of fixity in a synchronic sense, and then change in a diachrotic sense. I think there's a way that it becomes very useful to look at the act more so than the ideology in certain contexts. Ideology, of course, matters, but then you move into questions of motivation that never really lead anywhere fruitful, at least for historians. Anthropologists, I think, are a little bit better about that. But, yeah, that's it.
Thank you both for those comments, questions. Very interesting. I'll deal with the second question first. And Thank you very much for that suggestion. Actually, this is something that I am quite interested in doing, and I'm doing some new work now that is focusing on other populations, in particular the idea that even people who may be seen as white, white Canadians and so on, may not identify that way, may have a variety of backgrounds that they call forth in their own self-identity. And so, I mean, I do think that it is problematic, as you mentioned, to always have white scholars going and studying the topic of race. I mean, to a certain extent, we need to be bringing diversity both into the researchers as well as into the subject matters. And often, I think white subjects tend to be excluded as if they're not part of the issue of race, which is, of course, ridiculous. On the topic of, sort of how to interpret the dolls, I have to admit that, before today, I hadn't thought of it as an issue of violence. My interpretation was very much like yours. I sort of thought, oh, isn't that interesting that, this is sort of meant to represent anyone, any person. But, I think the whole point of it being faceless is that it's open to many different interpretations. And as you say, whether you're going home and drawing your own face on it or not, it does leave that openness to sort of impose on it what meaning you will, in a sense. Following up on the first comment, I mean, this is something that I think about a lot, and I also think about in my research and in my teaching and so on. And of course, there have been huge debates on this. Does the act of studying race keep it alive, or is it an important step in understanding inequalities and realities that exist, and that not studying them and ignoring them does more of a disservice? I tend to fall in the latter camp, but I understand both sides of that debate very well. The one thing I will say is that I do think that there's a particular danger in certain understandings of race as being biological, inherent, essential, and perhaps this is a little bit naive, but I do tend to think that challenging that idea goes a certain way towards saying, hang on, there's no support for them. But second of all, the way that race has been used goes way beyond that. And by picking it apart, dissecting it, thinking about the ways that it's used in reality, and showing that to people, and showing not just research subjects, but a wider audience that race has been used in a variety of different ways that is very different from that one assumption of race being something essential and unchangeable and immutable. The very fact that race is something that can change with movement to a new place, and that concepts of it can change. I mean, I think that goes a certain way towards showing people how much of a social construction this is. Now, perhaps that's an overly optimistic view, but that's my way of thinking about it.
I would actually support that by just reference to the early modern period. Again, this is certainly an early modern European perspective, but I mean, the historians who try to do history, sometimes try to do history, will often argue that there's something like some kind of a modern concept of race in the later 18th and the 19th century that emerges, and I would dissent somewhat from the idea that what we have been dealing with totally in this panel are facts. So that difference, human variation, is a matter of curiosity, not of biology, for European invaders and colonizers and killers in the 16th and 17th centuries. So one can trace very clearly, I think, for what it's worth, different categories, not only of identification and difference-making, but also different meta-categories of what that very act would be about. It would certainly not be a biological fact in the 17th or early 18th century to speak of human variation. One would be speaking, if one's looking at these euros, of notions of civility, notions of religion, certainly notions of barbarism as well, not to dispute that. But the very terms in which human difference is talked about is radically different, I would say, from what takes place in the 19th or the 20th century, or rather, this is what many people would argue. There are very important basic differences in conceptualizing human variation and what kind of knowledge that is. It may not be a fact at all until a certain point.
I think that's a good place to stop. We can all continue these conversations all day long. Okay, thank you.